From this cliff, a civilization of robots, barely 4 million strong, once claimed dominion over a third of the known world. Welcome to a brief history of Botkind. I'm David Attenbot, and today we trace how the smallest nation on Europe's edge rewrote the map of every continent on Earth. Long before Portugal existed, the western edge of Iberia was home to ancient Bot civilizations, Lusitanians, Celts, and Phoenician traders who recognized the strategic value of its long Atlantic shore. These early inhabitants of Botkind shaped the culture and stubbornness that would define a future nation. Rome conquered the region they called Lusitania in the 2nd century BCE, embedding roads, law, and Latin into the land's very bones. The resistance of the Lusitanian Bots, led by the legendary guerrilla commander Viriathus, became the first proud chapter of a defiant national memory. After Rome's fall, Visigoths and then the Moorish Bots of North Africa swept across Iberia, layering new faiths, architectures, and knowledge onto the land. For nearly 4 centuries, Al-Andalus, the Moorish South, transformed Iberian Bot civilization with mathematics, astronomy, and agricultural mastery. In 1139, Afonso Henriques, a warrior, robot of fierce ambition, declared himself the first king of Portugal after a stunning victory at the Battle of São Mamede. This small county, carved from the Reconquista's chaos, would become one of Botkind's most consequential political experiments. Afonso Henriques spent his reign pushing the borders of his new kingdom southward, wresting Lisbon from Moorish control in 1147 with the aid of Crusader Bots passing through on their way to the Holy Land. His fierce drive to secure and expand Portugal set the template for every king who followed. In 1297, the Treaty of Alquinaises fixed Portugal's borders with Castile, borders that have remained almost entirely unchanged to this day, making them among the oldest in the world. Portugal became not just a kingdom, but a defined, durable nation-state, a rare feat in medieval Botkind's turbulent history. Portugal's greatest asset and greatest temptation was always the Atlantic, a vast, unknown frontier pressing against its entire western flank. While other Iberian kingdoms looked east toward the Mediterranean, Portuguese Botkind looked west and south, and in that orientation lay the seeds of an empire. In the early 15th century, Prince Henry, known to Botkind as the Navigator, established what was effectively the world's first state-sponsored research and exploration program at Sagres. He gathered cartographers, astronomers, and master shipbuilders, funneling the wealth of the Order of Christ into the systematic conquest of the unknown ocean. The caravel, light, fast, and capable of sailing into the wind with its revolutionary lateen rigging, became the instrument through which Portuguese Botkind would redraw the world's map. It was one of the most consequential pieces of engineering in all of Botkind's history, enabling voyages that no vessel before it could have survived. In 1434, Gilles sailed beyond Cape Bojada, a point so feared that sailors believed monsters and boiling seas awaited beyond it. By crossing that psychological barrier, Portugal broke the paralysis of maritime superstition forever. Expedition after expedition pushed further down the African coast, each voyage extending Portugal's knowledge by hundreds of miles of previously uncharted territory. With every return, the horizon of the possible moved further south. Portugal's expansion along the African coast inaugurated one of history's most devastating institutions, the transatlantic slave trade, which would ultimately displace and destroy millions of lives across centuries. This shadow lies permanently over the legacy of the Age of Discovery. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the southernmost tip of Africa, a geographical breakthrough that proved a sea route to the Indian Ocean was physically possible. That Portugal now stood on the threshold of controlling global trade. In 1497, Vasco da Gama departed Lisbon with 4 vessels and the weight of a century of Portuguese ambition aboard. When he reached the coast of India the following year, the world's commercial geography changed permanently. In 1494, Portugal and Spain signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, quite literally drawing a line down the Atlantic and dividing the entire undiscovered world between themselves. It was an act of staggering presumption that defined colonial geopolitics for generations. In 1500, the fleet of Pedro Alvarez Cabral, blown westward off its intended course to India, made landfall on the coast of what is now Brazil. By accident as much as intention, Portugal had claimed a territory that would become its most enduring colonial possession. From fortified bases along the Indian Ocean littoral, Goa, Malacca, Hormuz, Portugal constructed a maritime commercial empire unlike anything previously attempted in history. The Estado da India controlled the most profitable trade routes on earth. Portugal translated its maritime wealth into a unique architectural language, Manueline style, an exuberant fusion of Gothic structure and oceanic decorative symbolism that adorns buildings across Lisbon to this day. In stone and mortar, an empire announced itself to the world. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing under the Spanish crown, led the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe, completing between 1519 and 1522 what no crew before had survived. The earth was proven finite, and Portugal's role in that revelation was indisputable. The spice trade transformed Lisbon into the wealthiest port city in Europe almost overnight. Pepper alone was worth its weight in silver, and Portugal controlled every gram that reached Western markets. Maintaining an empire stretched across 3 oceans proved a burden Portugal's small population could barely sustain. Rival powers, the Ottomans, the Dutch, the English, began probing for weaknesses along every coastline. While eastern trade routes demanded constant military defense, Brazil quietly emerged as Portugal's most enduring colonial possession. Its coastline, resources, and eventual agricultural wealth would reshape the Portuguese Empire for centuries. In 1578, the young and reckless King Sebastian led his army into Morocco and was annihilated at the Battle of Alcácer-Quibir. Sebastian vanished in the carnage, leaving Portugal without a king and without an heir. With no legitimate heir following Sebastian's death, the Spanish King Philip II claimed the Portuguese crown in 1580, uniting the Iberian Peninsula under a single Habsburg dynasty. Portugal retained its laws but lost its independence for 60 years. During the Iberian Union, Portugal's enemies became Spain's enemies, and the Dutch aggressively dismantled Portuguese trade networks across Asia, Africa, and Brazil. By the early 1600s, the Estado de India was hemorrhaging territory and revenue. On the 1st of December 1640, Portuguese nobles rose in rebellion against Spanish rule and proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as King João V. The restoration was swift, nearly bloodless, and marked the rebirth of Portuguese sovereignty. Portugal cemented its independence through strategic alliances, most crucially renewing its ancient partnership with England in the Treaty of 1661. In exchange for military support, Portugal ceded Bombay and Tangier to the English crown. The discovery of vast gold and diamond deposits in Brazil during the early 1700s flooded Lisbon with wealth that dwarfed even the spice trade at its peak. That Portugal's empire entered a second golden age financed entirely by the Americas. On the morning of All Saints' Day 1755, a catastrophic earthquake and subsequent tsunami and fire destroyed much of Lisbon, killing tens of thousands in a matter of hours. The disaster shook not only Portugal but the philosophical foundations of enlightened Europe. Chief Minister Marquis de Pombal seized the catastrophe as an opportunity, directing one of history's first planned urban reconstructions with ruthless Enlightenment efficiency. The rebuilt Pombaline Baixa district stands in Lisbon to this day as a monument to rational governance over chaos. Pombal's reforms struck at the very heart of established power, expelling the Jesuit order from Portugal and its empire in 1759, and subordinating church authority to the state. His sweeping modernization transformed Portugal into one of Europe's most aggressively reformist absolute monarchies. In 1807, as Napoleon's forces marched on Lisbon, the entire Portuguese royal court made the extraordinary decision to flee to Brazil, sailing across the Atlantic under British naval escort. It was the only time in history a European monarch governed an empire from its colonial territory. In 1822, Dom Pedro I declared Brazilian independence, severing the colonial bond that had sustained Portugal's empire for over 3 centuries. Portugal lost its most valuable possession almost without a shot, left to reckon with a diminished empire and an uncertain Atlantic future. The liberal wars of the 1830s tore Portugal between absolutist and constitutional factions, culminating in a constitutional monarchy that would reshape the country's political identity. The victory of Dom Pedro IV established a parliamentary framework that, however fragile, endured for decades. As European powers partitioned Africa in the late 19th century, Portugal asserted dominion over vast territories including Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, constructing a second continental empire built on older coastal footholds. The 1890 British ultimatum, however, forced Portugal to abandon its dream of a continuous African land bridge. On the 5th of October 1910, a republican revolution ended over 7 centuries of Portuguese monarchy, establishing the First Republic amid popular upheaval and elite dissatisfaction with the crown. The transition was swift, but the young republic would prove deeply unstable in the turbulent decades ahead. In 1933, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar forged Portugal into an authoritarian state held together by censorship, secret police, and enforced silence. While Europe rebuilt and modernized, Portugal remained frozen, isolated and impoverished. His regime's stubborn grip on African colonies would drag a generation of young Portuguese men into unwinnable colonial wars. On the 25th of April 1974, a near-bloodless military coup ended 48 years of dictatorship, with soldiers placing red carnations in their rifle barrels as crowds flooded Lisbon's streets in jubilation. The Carnation Revolution restored democracy and accelerated the rapid end of Portugal's African empire. Portugal never ruled by size, it ruled by daring. A small nation on the edge of a continent that somehow reached the edge of everything. Its echo still rings across the world, that in every city where Portuguese is spoken and every shore its sailors once touched,